So on my view, social movements have globally been the main agents of social change. The view that I am sort of building on all the time is a view that gets initially articulated first by Michael Walzer, little book from 1984, Interpretation and Social Criticism, where he says that insofar as we can recognize it, moral progress is more a matter of workmanlike social criticism and political struggle than it is paradigm-shattering speculation. So that should immediately give you sense of why I'm somewhat distanced from some of the main traditions of theoretical reflection and social theory. I have a very Deweyan view of a kind of philosophical humility that actually presumes that social movements have a lot more to teach us often than we have to teach them, or even to teach ourselves about how social movement, how social change works. And I understand social movements as sustained, organized endeavors in extra-institutional contentious politics. That's a phrase from the sociologist Charles Tilly, through which social groups pursue interests, address or assert the satisfaction of needs that are important, and assert claims of dignity or worth. And as I understand what they're doing, they're always pursuing a goal of changing political and social institutions and practices. And I never want to deny that social change can happen through other routes, but the most effective, most efficient modes of social change depend upon the activity of social movements. So now the second question I want to answer, and this is going to be developed over a couple of slides, it's important for me that you have to, as a theorist, start by asking, how have the social movements that have actually been effective, how have they functioned? I discuss in Making Space for Justice 23 different kinds of social movements that I think fall most naturally into three categories. So social reform movements that are seeking to make democracies more just. I actually spend a little more time on this than others. Then there are democracy movements that are seeking to upend authoritarian regimes. And some of the methods that we need to understand that make this kind of social movement possible will obviously look very different from what happens in the social reform movements, which I'll say a bit more about as things progress. And then I think we need to look at how certain kinds of international movements have developed. In the book, I talk mostly about the emergence of the international human rights movement, but I think the kind of understanding we're going to develop of social change that emerges from looking at global movements is actually going to be necessary for thinking about climate change in a way that I think none of us who are social thinkers of any kind have anticipated. It's going to have to be both global and local at the same time. It's going to require new kinds of cooperation between communities and societies that haven't expected they had to cooperate. The global North is going to have to cooperate with the global South. And that's understanding how that happens is going to have to be central to any contemporary theory of social change. But I want to say that I think a social theory that makes sense of how social movements work has to identify certain movements as exemplary. And I could say more later about why that seems so critical to me. But I think what we need to do is which ones have been not just the most successful, but in some ways the most collectively rational. And when we analyze how they work, what methods they rely on, the assumptions they make, then we discover what the elements of a plausible social theory ought to be talking about. And three that have been critical in my understanding of what social movements do and how we ought to theorize about them in some more general, comprehensive way are first the classic phase of the US civil rights movement, is from 1955 to 65. This is exemplary to my mind in almost every way possible. It is an extraordinary example of collective rationality from a group of people who weren't deemed capable of such. It raises all sorts of questions about how it's possible to shape political agency amongst people who didn't expect that they had any, about how to change people's self-conceptions, about how to get people in different social elements of a group, the elites versus the non-elites, the US civil rights movement was especially good at this in ways that I've not seen other movements manage. How did they do this? And then for me, the third element of this civil rights movement's importance is the role of nonviolence as a philosophical commitment. I'm one of those people like Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepan, and I would add Gene Sharp, the philosopher of how to move from democracy to dictatorship. I actually believe the single most rational and most successful form of social action actually typically involves civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. And I think I'm trying to understand how it was so successful in this movement will teach us a lot. My second exemplary movement is the Velvet Revolution in the former Czechoslovakia. The Power of the Powerless, that essay by Václav Havel is, to my mind, one of the most instructive accounts of how it's possible to intervene in and reject the constraining elements of a totalizing narrative. And I discovered this, actually, I had been kind of dismissive of his view, and I know not everybody is a fan of Havel, but the theory of how to intervene in totalizing worldviews, totalizing narratives that emerges from that essay is, to my mind, exemplary. And it will help make sense for the movement seeking, to upend, say, an authoritarian regime. There is more insight in that essay about how to do that than almost anywhere else. Then there's a movement against South African apartheid. And this is critical for me because as someone who thinks that nonviolence is collectively rational most of the time, it cannot be denied that apartheid would not have come to an end without this unusual intertwining of violence and nonviolence that you see over time in this movement. On the other hand, one of the most remarkable things which social theory needs to make sense of is that there is a moment, it's about 1990, when Mandela is released from prison, when he and his advisors come to realize that unless they're able to allow the transition to a non-apartheid system, to a democracy, to happen non-violently, to prevent particularly racial civil war, everything that was valuable about the goal of a more democratic South Africa would have been out of reach. And that doesn't mean that everything that's valuable was preserved, right? We know that contemporary South Africa is in dire straits, and I have a theory later about why that is. But I think these three movements are exemplary in the kinds of ways that ought to be taken seriously by social theory. So then my next question is, how do we articulate the values? What should a theory of social change, help us understand? I think it should do three things. It should answer the question of how to articulate the values that should be driving social change. And here, I've come reluctantly, actually, over time to reject the view of justice that actually shaped much of my early intellectual life. I've rejected, like Iris Young, I've rejected the idea of this distributive justice paradigm as central. And I've come to think that Young was right, that you do need a kind of enabling conception of justice. It's not going to be a conception that allows reduction to a single decision principle. It's going to include clusters of values that are relevant to undoing each kind of enabling constraint that matters. And I don't think you learn that if you're a Rawlsian looking at a Rawlsian-inspired theorist, looking at how social justice gets produced. I don't think you would understand that unless you looked at the way social movements work, which leads to the second thing a theory of social change should do, is understand how social movements work. And one of the things I've come to think is that there's a very well-studied set of projects, everything boycotts, sit-ins, labor strikes and slowdowns and occupations and so forth that have gotten theoretical attention. But there's a whole other range of projects. I talk about narrative activism, aesthetic activism, language activism that are central to the work that all the exemplary movements we've seen are doing, but have gotten insufficient attention in conventional social theory. And then thirdly, a theory of social change should help us learn what the social movements are teaching us about the theory and the practice of social change. I accept a view defended by the sociologists Ron Ironman and Andrew Jameson that social movements are forms of cognitive practice. They're sites of collective creation of ideas and insights, and not just about how to engage in practice, but about the theoretical underpinnings of the practices that are actually going to make a difference in the world. My fourth question is, at what level should a theory of social change operate? At one point in our email suggestion about what to discuss, the question of whether I was young was right to think that social theory should be looking kind of problem by problem, if you will, and then trying to make sense of it. For the most part, I think that is the appropriate approach. Most progress occurs locally in particular domains of social and political concern. By domain, I mean something here like the domain of gender justice, the domain of racial and ethnic justice, economic justice. It's not that these domains have impermeable boundaries between them, they don't. But very often social movements are only able to generate change by working within a given domain. And then sometimes they realize that now to make the change, say, about gender justice that we value really robust and stable, we'll have to look obviously at economic institutions and structures as well. But going back actually to something that Sally mentioned, I think some problems, and defeating authoritarianism is one. I think addressing climate change, which I've actually become much more interested of late, they demand a much more comprehensive sort of set of theoretical assumptions, as well as a more global activism. Some of it has to be local, but some of it has to be global. And that is something that a theory of social change has to be aware of. My fifth question is, what are some important mechanisms for generating social change? So this is the fifth of the sixth question. And I've mentioned already that theory has focused on certain kinds of methods more frequently than others, the well-theorized methods, boycotts, sit-ins, occupations, strikes and work slowdowns. It's even things like fasts, right? Hunger strikes. They deserve attention, but three less well-theorized mechanisms need more attention as well. One of them is narrative activism, one is aesthetic activism, and one is language activism. Narrative activism focuses on the socially dominant narratives that we have to contend with as we try to understand ourselves and our place in the world and why the world is the way it is. Aesthetic activism looks at the kind of aesthetic texture, if you will, of social and political realms. In summer 2020, right, globally, people appreciated that sometimes if you didn't change the kind of symbolic expression of a given group's claim to supremacy by maybe removing the movement that embodies the supremacy, you're not going to be able to even imagine what a more just world might look like. And then there's language activism, which addresses linguistic forms of all sorts. Both the labels we use to describe ourselves and the labels others use to describe us, but also the concepts we have available to name certain kinds of injustice, or the kinds of concepts that others have formulated to hide the fact of injustice from us. And I think that ends up being very critical to understanding what social change requires. So I believe, that's my last slide. So now I get to the last slide. How is social change possible? I start from the assumption that maybe the most important fact, and it's a fact that leads me to reject virtually every theory of ideology, including Marx, including Althusser, including, sadly, every contemporary theory by the colleagues in this call I most admire. I think what we call ideologies are socially dominant narratives that claim a certain kind of comprehensiveness. They claim a certain kind of authority. They may be interwoven with, if they're master narratives or brand narratives, interwoven with secondary narratives that we need to tease apart and understand. But it is narrative dominance, not ideology, that rules the world. Those who tell the stories rule the world. Socially dominant narratives work partly by constraint, right? They define social roles that initially limit what we can think and do and be, and even how we understand ourselves. They also work by generating consent. Hannah Arendt was very interested in particular in this. And I think one of the lessons that we can take from social movements, they understand these two facts about dominant narratives. And I think many of them have appreciated how to work both against the constraining notions of social identities, but the consent to narratives that legitimize injustice in very powerful ways. What they understand is what's in my second bullet, that even the most complex, even the most totalizing socially dominant narrative is always contestable. And if you want to see, to my mind, one of the most important discussions of how, it's Václav Havel's Power and the Powerless, where he actually says, even when a way of viewing the world is kind of suppressing human independence and human agency and denying that the world it legitimizes is causing suffering, it's never able to completely suppress an underlying truth that human agents retain the ability to change their world when they do it collectively in sustained, organized endeavors called social movements. And then I'll conclude by saying that contestation is sometimes most important, contestation of narratives, for understanding themselves, for understanding the possibilities of their own political agency. Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, Native American writers in the contemporary moment, an author named David Schroyer, who's writing new histories of Native America. They understand this fact about contestation. My worry about the way some theorists talk about ideology is that they deny in the process that there is this openness, this permeability of dominant narratives to human agency and the possibility of social change. Thank you.